It's Friday, everyone. Welcome to the wrap up. We have two amazing guests with us. We have a veteran of the wrap up. We have Jeremy, and
Hello.
we have a familiar face to the stream, but a new face to the wrap up, Michelle. Michelle is a member of our Asians Read Caricature crew, and we have been slowly chipping away at that book. In fact, we actually have a caricature stream next Saturday,
That we do. That
um,
we do.
and I am super excited about that. But those are just my introductions. I would love for both of you to introduce yourselves and what you do. Do you want? Let's start
Jer
with Michelle, since you're new to the
Oh,
stream.
okay. Hi, I'm Michelle Rapp. I'm also known as Kiln Fiend Potter on Twitter. I mostly do. I have a lot of interest, mostly in Magic the Gathering and also RPGs. I love talking about them, especially concerning diversity and inclusion. I also make pottery in my spare time, and I like to post pictures of my cats on my CPAP machine on Twitter. So if you want to follow me there, you can see all that good stuff.
Heck yeah. How about you, Jeremy? What have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm Jeremy. You've seen me on the wrap up a couple times, and previously when we read through all of L5R. I have been doing what I always do, blogging about tabletop games and video games. I've also been doing some freelancing lately for D&D Beyond, actually.
Yeah,
No kidding.
Oh,
no
and
kidding.
I got to thank you, Daniel, because you actually told me that
I
D&D
got you
Beyond
that.
was
I
looking
got
for
you.
writers. So it's it's all thanks to Daniel really that I reached out, and I think they're doing a whole bunch of internal changes, but they were looking for some folks to write some stuff for them. So if you go to D&D Beyond right now, you can see two recent articles that I've written. It's like technical stuff related to D&D, like how to run chases, how to use more environmental effects around a battlefield. But it's been fun, particularly
How to
fun and
create gripping
challenging.
gripping chase scenes in
Yeah,
D&D. I'm gonna link that.
particularly fun and challenging because it's D&D Beyond. I need to stick with the official rule set. I can't do what I normally do in my games and be like, okay, so this is not in fifth edition. I've stolen this from Pathfinder. I've stolen this from Call of
Oh,
Cthulhu, but I'm basically, so I need to like stick to fifth edition. And it's been an interesting experience writing within the confines of only the rules that are available within like the Dungeon Master's Guide and whatnot. So yeah, that's been my biggest news the last month, really.
Do you just have the chase article
I've
up so far?
chased in the first one. I think it's at the top of the website right now about creating
Oh, there it is. Yeah,
dynamic combats. Yeah,
environmental hazards.
yeah.
Dude, that's awesome. I'm gonna share
that's
this.
dope.
I'm
So
glad
yeah, and
that.
so I'll have some more stuff going up on there, probably for the foreseeable future.
Nice. I'm glad that they got you when they approached me and they were like, "Yo, do you know anybody who would want to do this?" And I was like, "I'm not the right person for this because I don't care about official D&D stuff."
Yeah,
Um,
it's
and I was like, "But I know
yeah,
somebody who is a professional writer, loves D&D lore, and would absolutely love to do this." And then I DM'd you.
yeah, no, and I gotta thank you for that, Daniel. It's been like I said, it's been challenging in some ways because I didn't realize how much of the actual DMG rules I tend to skirt around, and
Yeah.
how much of
Yeah.
the
Oh yeah.
official lore I tend to mangle into my own interpretation. So I think writing within limitations and writing within specific rules can actually be a good exercise for creativity.
That was the biggest challenge in writing Candlekeep, actually.
Yeah, I'm
Was
sure. Yeah.
biggest challenges when they were like, "Okay, you're writing a 12th level adventure." I was like, "Okay, okay,
So then you
cool."
actually have to like pull out the books and like study
I
this and study that and be like, how would you actually do this
Well,
within?
well, they were like, "You have to do Candlekeep," and I was like, "Oh, okay." So I got to read up. Like, I know about Candlekeep, but I got to really read up
Yeah.
about Candlekeep to do it. And I think the hardest part about writing, like in terms of D&D lore and D&D adventures, especially ones set within their world, is that you
Hmm.
have to really play ball with their lore.
Absolutely.
totally.
And I was like, I
Yeah.
can't, you know, I was like, I can avoid writing Caricature. I can avoid having Caricature in there, but I couldn't avoid having show in there.
By the way,
So,
I am psyched for your adventure. You got me to read
Dragon,
Dragon Plus
Dragon
magazine,
Plus,
which I
yeah.
have not read in a while, and I read the preview of your adventure. Everybody watching should check it out. Dragon Plus magazine, the not as good as the old Dragon
It's
magazine,
not,
but
it's
it's
not
the
as
new
good as the
version.
old one.
But it has a preview of Daniel as well as everyone else's. Like Kiana's adventures in there also. And
Yeah, they
also,
previewed every single person's adventures. what's really interesting about it is that I didn't know anything about everyone else's stuff. I didn't know who was on the project until they announced it. I knew Kiana was, and I knew Graham was because we were talking, but I didn't know anyone else who was on the project. So it was like oddly disconnected, which was like a weird thing because now I'm working on a project and I know everybody who's on it, which is
Agatha, we should interview Daniel about the Candlekeep experience.
We're gonna do that.
Coast.
We're gonna do
Yeah.
that for an
That'd be
episode.
great.
Because I would love to have Kiana on as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we should definitely
Totally.
do that.
Totally.
But we're not here to talk
With
about
hard-hitting questions.
hard-hitting questions. Hard-hitting questions. Would you do it again, Daniel? What's your favorite candle in Candlekeep? Who keeps the candles? I don't know.
What happens?
Candlekeeper.
Who keeps the
Hello,
candles?
Who keeps the candles in Candlekeep?
Lois Lane reporter here for the M&S Times. What happens to all the candles when they burn down?
That's
You
so good.
replace
I
them?
love it.
Yeah,
That's
so
really good.
Fuck yeah.
that's really good. Yeah, we'll do that for a separate episode because that comes out next month. But Agatha, Steve, do you have any news before we get started? Anything you got? Anything you want to share? If not, that's okay.
The only thing I'm going to share is that I've taken the dive into fermenting my own food now. I've always wanted to try it. I've gone into sauerkraut. I started at
Nice.
sauerkraut because
Nice.
sauerkraut requires no ingredients besides salt and cabbage. So like I'm into it. Like let's reduce the amount of ingredients. Let's give it a try. It's also a great arm workout. Like you get like good forearm grip strength out of it. So like I'm super into it. Like
So
it-
what we're gonna get Steve's sauerkraut workout coming to you soon on your new YouTube channel where you combine cuisine
yeah.
and fitness.
Well, look,
I-
this is gonna be it's not only a beauty channel, but it's also a food channel.
And
my-
also a fitness channel.
Specifically a fermenting.
My hypothesis is that the more like muscle work you put into it, the faster it will ferment. Like
Is
it'll
that-
always take time.
Is
Like,
that s-
that's my
science?
hypothesis.
okay?
Okay.
I mean, I can kind of see that maybe, but
There's like a
we should
pseudoscience
talk about
behind
this.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
so
don't
we'll
see
see.
it, but I support you.
Yeah. And like maybe it adds zero to it, in which case you just get a good arm work out of it and you're done.
right.
Is it like
Like-
churning
Right.
butter? Is it like churning butter? you only have to do
So
that.
the arm workout is to like break down like cabbage because cabbage is a hardy
Yeah.
vegetable.
It's a very fibrous vegetable, and
Yeah.
I think the more you break down
Oh.
the cellular walls, the more the salt water is going to be able to permeate and thus begin the fermenting process. Now that we have introduction of like, we get the sugars out, and then the yeast can come in and like hang out with the sugar.
But
Um,
it's also possible that by breaking it down too quickly, I've made some bad sauerkraut. So like we'll see. Like if you like go too hard, you ruin your sauerkraut. You have to like be gentle.
Really?
So there's a
So we'll see.
balance.
So
We'll see.
there's an art to it, is what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Probably. Like I don't know.
We're coming for you,
That's weird.
binging with Babish.
Yeah,
That's what we're doing now.
Really, this is my first time making
Sauerkraut
it. So
with
like
Steve.
let me get that YouTube channel right now.
Yeah, sauerkraut with Steve.
But I think if I were to do that, I would go like sour Steve or something like. So that means you could do other sour things, not just sauerkraut.
Oh, I see. I see.
Oh,
Like,
you
get
can
into,
make
like, good
sour
ki-
beers.
Sour beers,
Sour
good
beers,
kimchi.
sauerkraut,
Kimchi
sour
is
candy.
really hard to make. Kimchi, like I looked into it, like kimchi is
Yeah.
like way
It is
outside of
pretty
like what I
hard.
can
You
make.
need like a kiddie pool. Like
You-
every
Yeah.
time I've
Put it
seen
on
it, like you need a
ground for
kiddie
years
pool to put all the
and
cabbage in.
cultivate.
yeah.
I
Like
agree.
Like-
I
Every leaf, you gotta. It's like baklava. You've got to like get
Totally.
the mixture in every layer.
You have
So
to
complex,
romance each
so
layer.
hard.
Yeah,
You
you
have to
put
romance each
romance on
layer.
each layer. Like it's that's. But I mean, when you make food, you make it with love, and that's what you're here to talk about, right?
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I haven't.
There you go.
I don't have anything that's been going on recently either, aside from the Balikbayan Into the Dark series, which next week is the last episode. The rest of the episodes are uploaded onto YouTube. The one that just passed will be uploaded tomorrow, and it's very angsty. I feel like it's getting more
Good.
and more angsty.
I can't believe
This
that
is
it's the
interesting.
finale already.
I know.
It's just like, what is time now?
We discovered the forest, and people met with their exes.
People are probably like, forest. This is cyberpunk. What about the concrete jungle? Go watch Bullock Bayan and learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Steve, do you have
So
anything?
that's
Oh, sorry, Agatha.
No, Agatha, talk about Balak Band. I talk about sauerkraut. I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
One other thing, I just announced a thing that we're gonna do in the future for Asians Represent called the Bureau of Paranatural Survey.
Nice logo.
Thank you.
yeah, that's a good logo.
So we are going to be doing that in the near future. That will be a pre-recorded series.
Yeah.
Because I am making like fake documents and stuff. Agatha, I've shown Agatha one of them.
Yeah, Daniel sent me, and I was like, I kept on trying to zoom in. The text was so small.
Enhance.
I'll send you the full thing.
Enhance.
I'll send you the full thing because everything in there is like
Nice.
game lore stuff.
Yeah, it's really sick.
So yeah, we're gonna be doing a new series. I'm still sorting out what system we want to use. It will either be Cortex Prime or a hack of either Mothership or the Year Zero engine. If it's the Year Zero engine, that means I have to write the whole thing myself. So
know any
we're
of
gonna
these.
figure it out. It's gonna be great. I can't wait.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's the
That's really
only
exciting.
Asians Represent announcement that we have. Jeremy already said the Dragon Plus. I keep wanting to say Dungeon.
Me too. That's
Yeah.
what comes out. Dungeon
The
Magazine,
Dragon
Magazine.
Plus article is out. I think I'm going to be on Adventuring Academy on Dimension 20 sometime next month, as well as Inverse. I did an interview for Inverse this week, and it cost me $15 to do the interview because they did it over the phone, and then I got my bill.
Oh,
Yo.
Damn. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, so like
That's such a like a Canadian thing where it's like, oh,
I know.
yeah.
I
I'm
was gonna
sorry.
say.
I'll pay my phone bill. Don't worry. But yeah, that's all we got. But let's talk about romance, because romance is something
Yeah.
that we've talked about a fair amount on Asians Represent, especially when it comes to episode 4 of Dungeons and Asians. And I'm gonna be quite honest. Romance in TTRPGs is a topic that I know very little about, and something that I've had very little experience with. I have played one romance TTRPG, and it's Starcrossed. I have played
yeah.
Starcrossed and like the one that's explicitly designed for it.
Yes.
And I have GM'd games where there is romance, but I think the best one that I have ever GM'd was episode 4 of Dungeons and Asians, where we had Agatha couldn't make it to the recording, so we had, luckily your character was actually injured, so your character was like bedridden for the episode, and
Indeed.
we did a whole thing with Kiana as the Empress, who was having like romantic times with a Z with Steve's character Ning. And we had
That's like our Roll20.
and then there was For the
November
Queen.
game.
And then there was For the Queen.
For the Queen, where my character had romantic feelings for Steve's character.
Yeah.
Totally.
Always Steve. Damn.
I know.
And so like for this episode, because this was your idea, Agatha, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so this was your idea. I would love to talk about everyone's experiences, like on two fronts. One with RPGs or TTRPGs that are designed to facilitate romance, or even the breakdown of romance, or the circumstances leading up to a romance. And then two, I would love to talk about how we introduce romance into games that don't necessarily have
The mechanics
romance
there
as
for
the
it.
focal point or a mechanic for it, like you said, Agatha. So like
Yeah.
using romance in D&D. So I would love for us to talk about that. I would love for us to, on the last Friday of February, like Agatha said, when we were planning this, I would love for us to talk.
Valentine's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what is really interesting in terms of the way that, at least in the indie RPG scene, is the trend in more romance mechanics in games. So there's, I feel like one of the big originals of a TTRPG that's specifically romance focused is, of course, Emily Care-Boss's The Romance Trilogy, where there's 3 games in here that are romance focused. and they're very interesting in terms of the kind of mechanics that they involve. And I think that really kind of opened some doors in terms of the possibilities for people, because I think before that there wasn't really games that mechanized romance specifically, because romance has always happened in TTRPGs, of course. Like, you know, that's the kind of story that draws us, that we're into. So even if it's not in the mechanics, we still have them, right? But that was one of the first ones, and then like more games came out, especially I feel like really small. Like there are a lot of two-person duet games that actually have that. Like there was one that was called The Sky is Gray and You Are Sad. I think that's an earlier duet game. And then there's, of course, Alex Roberts' Starcrossed, which Daniel, you played, and that uses a Jenga to simulate the kind of tension that happens in this like will they won't they kind of relationship. And it's really fun and tense. But and I feel like in other games, because Michelle, you were talking about how you're excited to play Thirsty Sword Lesbians, right?
Yes.
So I haven't read it, so I don't know what kind of mechanics are in there, but there's been a lot more games that have sections in the game text that talk about like romance or intimate relationships. Like for example, there's Apocalypse World, right? Like there, in the first edition, it was called Sex Moves. I think in the second edition, they changed it to Intimacy moves because they didn't want it to they wanted to be more inclusive, I think was the reason why. But like that is in there. And then in The Watch, which is another powered by the Apocalypse game, there's also a lot of like intimacy kind of like questions in the playbooks and also in the moves themselves. Like there's the potential for romantic relationships is suggested already in the rules, in the mechanics themselves. And I think those are really interesting to think about in terms of like, to think about that we are providing mechanics for a particular kind of relationship in games. And like, I am very curious about what everyone else thinks about it. I think it's really fun. And I think it's interesting to see the way that different games try to address that. But of course, there's also, like Daniel, you said, the like, how do you introduce romance into a game that doesn't have these things? Or, I mean, even if it does have those mechanics there already, but in general, like, how do you, as a game master or facilitator, like introduce these
Yeah,
things?
so why don't we start with games that actively facilitate it? So you've mentioned the Romance trilogy, and I know that like I think Shoot for the Moon was the big one of those three, right? I just had a meeting with Heart of the Deernicorn, who's doing our merch, about the merchandise that we're doing. So we have an artist, and we're going to probably have a design for everyone to see at the end of April for merch. Noodle Dragon will be a thing. So yeah. So that's happening. So if you have ideas or something you want to see related to our Noodle Dragon, which is actually on screen right now, hit us up. But yeah, we were talking about games that do that, and Ross actually mentioned the romance trilogy, because I was like, we're gonna do this thing, and I really only know Starcrossed, and I didn't even think of The Watch, Agatha, and I own that game and I've played it, and romance actually never came up when I played it. And I'm kind of bummed that it didn't, because like that setting with romance would be particularly interesting.
Play it with Steve and I, and we'll give you the romance. Super.
I'm down. But like, I
Yeah.
want to know for everyone else, like, how about you, Steve? Have you played games that are designed to facilitate romance?
Beyond Starcross, no. But
That's
I
okay.
always have romance in my games.
Yeah.
I can't escape it. I like it sounds weird, but like ever since I really came into like deciding that tabletop RPGs are more than just this colonialist kill things and take their stuff, I realized that romance is a very good way to humanize characters. And I want to talk about like the human condition more in my games. And romance just was a natural way for almost all of my players to really just like dive into that, and it was like a great place for it. So I'm personally caught in this like weird place where I'm injecting romance into Dungeons and Dragons or other like mainstream tabletop RPGs, and I'm kind of on my own. I kind of have to like kind of figure it out myself, and it's working out really.
I'm the same as you, Steve.
And like
Yeah.
it's working out really well, and it is in part to like the care I'm putting into it, and also the empathy and like the care that my players are putting into it. So we're doing a great job. We're having a lot of fun talking about these romance storylines and a variety of them, but the game itself is kind of like it's there, like it's fine. It gives us a framework, but really we're doing all of the work, which is not bad, but generally not what you think about when you think about buying a game, right?
Yeah.
So my experience is quite limited,
So it's like me.
I guess. I would assume it's like based on what you said. I would say like almost identical. Yeah.
Yeah. Jeremy, how about you? You said similar to Steve's. Have you played Starcrossed?
I have not played Starcrossed. I haven't really played a game that specifically exemplifies romance and puts it at the forefront. Would like to, but I think I'm like Steve in that I find myself dealing with romance more often than I would have initially expected when I GM games. And also as a player, like my L5R character fell in love with another player's character, and that other character kind of changed her entire perception of the world. And that was something that happened naturally over the course of role playing. And it just so happened that me and the other guy who was playing this other character, like we had a really good camaraderie, and it just seemed very natural for my kind of like, you know, angry, angsty Lion Clan warrior who was questioning everything about her place in the world to kind of fall for the free form thinking of this esoteric Dragon Clan member. And then we played it out, and it became a huge thing in our campaign. So and in the games that I've GM'd as well, I've dealt with players ending the adventure married and in relationships with NPCs, and players in relationship with each other. It's always been interesting and fascinating to see.
How about you, Michelle?
It's really interesting because Agatha, I think, really set up this perfectly in terms of the way romance is used in these games. Right? We've got the mechanical and we've got the narrative, and they're both tools, and they serve very similar purposes. But I guess I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but it's very interesting. My experience with Thirsty Sword Lesbian so far, which is, by the way, really freaking fantastic, wonderfully indulgent, and just a pleasure to even just read. But the idea of trying to codify romance and relationships with people is it's touchy, and it's very complicated, right? Because when we're talking about that kind of relationship with another person, romance is such an incredibly powerful thing, because it's really exposing the most vulnerable parts of you as a character and as a person. And it is so, I think, mechanically speaking, it's one of the reasons why I'm so glad that like every game I've read that has this has been so focused on consent, has been focused on establishing boundaries. And I think that so far, I think, should still be a part of it. And I'm really happy that this new generation of romance and duet games establishes that trend. With regards to narrative, it's when we introduce like NPCs and things like that, I love having romance in my games. I always try to talk to my PCs first to be like, hey, so what's your character's orientation, what are they okay with, what are they not okay with, setting up those safety boundaries so that way I can introduce someone to them. Are you even open to having a relationship? That's very important to talk about first. And I just think it's a wonderful narrative way to help that character evolve over that story arc, over the campaign, right? Meeting someone and being sorry, there's an emergency vehicle like right outside my house.
They're just like
You're
Michelle,
okay,
you're talking
though, right?
You're talking so much truth. They're just like, we just an ambulance.
I just ambulance. So much truth that we need emergency vehicles in San Francisco.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's like, having a relationship with someone that is so intimate and so powerful can change a person. It doesn't even need to have sex. It doesn't even need to be like that kind of relationship there. It can just be, so having someone out there who understands and reflects your desires and can make you grow, help you grow into a better person, and likewise, that's amazing. And then of course we get, that's just, I'm just talking about monogamous relationships. We even talk about poly relationships. Like that's a whole other field. Like, so yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about romance in these games because it's an incredibly, I think people poo-poo it maybe sometimes because, oh, romance, whatever, it's a girly thing, but it's so powerful. Like that's why we have so many love songs, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people spend much of their life trying to find romance. It makes sense that, we should explore it in our games. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think now more than ever, I want that in my TTRPG sessions and stories. I think it's one because like I get to see it unfold in Dungeons and Asians. Like I get to see Kiana and Steve, and then the one that I really enjoy is Amar and Shuang, who is
Ditto.
supposed to be a one-off character that has become like a perma NPC because Amar was like, I want to like turn this into a thing, and I want to kind of see how it develops. But for me, it's just like I'm like a perma GM. Like I'm a player in one game, and it's with a group that won't be doing that sort of thing. We're also playing a game where my character's name is Savvy Guardsman Number 2.
Right.
I have 2 characters. Well, I had 5 characters. I'm down to 2 right
Is your
now.
Delta Green game?
No. Oh, Delta Green. No, I'm on my 4th Delta Green character.
Oh.
No,
Are you having
we're
romance in Delta Green? That'd be interesting.
Well, you know what? You can do romance in
You
Delta
can.
Green.
Could.
Yeah, you
because
could.
one of the things in Delta Green is that
I
your
know.
characters have to have bonds and attachments
Bonds
that kind
and
of help you
attachments, yeah.
heal. But the group that I'm playing with, they just don't do that, and that's
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to. So we got a question that is super interesting from
Yeah.
the chat actually from Bromid.
It's Yoshi. It's Yoshi from our community.
Thanks, Yoshi. Bromedic Fustian did it. Which is to hear our thoughts on the difference between romance, sex, and intimacy. And that is a very interesting thing because in a bunch of different Powered by the Apocalypse games that I've just kind of been flipping through. So in the original Apocalypse World game, it's called sex moves. So if you have sex with this particular playbook, that will go off, and then it's usually kind of like a power dynamic, power exchange sort of thing. Like some of them, they're like, okay, so I get to ask you a secret that you have to tell me truthfully after this happens, or some of them it's like, oh, because I want to be big and tough. After this happens, you get influence on me, or some things like that. And so that is how that's worded in that specific game. And then in The Sword, the Crown, the Unspeakable Power, which is a game that is basically like Game of Thrones and does it pretty well actually. That specific move is also called sex moves, I think. Yes. Yeah, so it's sex with this character. And then in Urban Shadows, it's called intimacy moves.
Yeah.
So it's when you have a moment of intimacy with this playbook, whether that's emotional or physical, then this happens. And again, it's a lot of things that I guess this kind of gets into like, what is romance? Like, and I guess I wanted to pose that to the group, but I also kind of wanted to talk about the way that it plays out in these mechanics that are written into games. So for example, in these playbooks, the way that intimacy happens as a mechanic, they reinforce the theme of the playbook.
Yeah.
And they usually end up making things either worse or or more dramatically compelling. So it, in a way, like the fact that these games have these moves in there means that you're almost like motivated sometimes to kind of play towards that, because if you're like, oh, that's kind of cool, like if I share a moment of intimacy with another person, I can ask them a question, they must answer it honestly. This is for the hunter in Urban Shadows. They will also ask you a question in return, and you answer it honestly or mark corruption. Corruption is a specific mechanic in Urban Shadows.
Right.
And it's kind of like you play towards this theme, right, for your character. It's always like it's this playbook is about sharing secrets with each other or not, and how that kind of like breaks you apart kind of thing. And so that's a really interesting thing to like have as a part of the mechanics of the game that you're playing. And you, because it's on the sheet on your playbook, you always have that in mind, right, when you're playing with other people. So what do y'all think about like the difference between romance, sex, and intimacy? And does it matter to you that there's a difference in the wording?
I think it's worth saying that because the examples that you've shared are PBTA games. It's worth sharing that in Urban Shadows in particular, which is a fantastic game, first of all. Urban Shadows is a very special game because they do a very good job of making sure that each playbook has enough choice and unique game mechanics that make each time you play the hunter, for example, that's the one you used, each time you play the hunter feels different, and you tell a story with each playbook. Unlike D&D and Pathfinder and a lot of the sort of the generic character sheet games, Urban Shadows and other PBTA games, the best PBTA games all have playbooks that tell their own stories, and all have playbooks that allow the players to tell a story as they develop that playbook. And I think Urban Shadows does it best with its corruption system. So like the hunter, you mark corruption when you hurt an innocent person as well. Or like the vampire in Urban Shadows can feed on things like emotion. And it doesn't have to be blood. But for me, in TTRPGs, I really like, or the things that I want to see on Daniel's wish list are that slow burn. I like that. I want that build up. I want to explore the circumstances that bring two people together, or divide two people. My partner and I just finished, or more, right? Mm-hmm. And my partner and I just finished watching Schitt's Creek, which is easily now one of my favorite TV shows, because of the romance, the romantic stories they tell in a show about people who lose everything. There are two storylines there. One about two people who fall in love, but end up separating, not because they've fallen out of love, but because the circumstances of their lives are leading them in different directions. And I really loved that. And that was like something that I would have loved to do in a TTRPG, or two characters who come from very different worlds, but kind of come together and overcome a lot of assumptions about whether or not they should be together because of the way they look or the way they act or where they came from. And so for me, when I'm looking at when we're talking about romance, sex, and intimacy in TTRPGs, I'm thinking about all of the little things that brought those characters together. I'm thinking about the sessions where they lock eyes for the first time, or they realize that there's something there. I'm thinking about the moments where they are vulnerable to one another. And that intimacy, to me, is a part of that romance, is a component of it. And the sex as well. But, I think you could also tell these stories and have romance in your RPGs without having sex in it, per se. And I know that a lot of people feel uncomfortable about that. And that is a point of much discussion, especially in the D&D world, where people were like, I want to seduce this person to do this thing. And so I think when introducing romance into them and that slow burn, those moments, I think what's really important when we're talking about that is consent outside of the story and collaboration between players, so that their characters can collaborate in that romantic sense. That long-winded way of me saying, for me, romance in TTRPGs is not only two characters coming together and the circumstances that bring them together, but also how the players in real life navigate that.
Totally. Michelle, I feel like you wanted to add on to that.
Thank you. So it's interesting to me because the question introduces three different terms that I think overlap in a lot of ways, but aren't all the same thing. Romance is really just about courtship. At least for me, it's about that courtship. It's about gaining intimacy is a part of it. Sex can be a part of it, but intimacy can also be its own thing, and so can sex. Like, I can definitely see a situation where just there's a character and they're just a disaster and they're hooking up with people everywhere, and that's just a whole different thing. There's no romance there. It's just straight to the point. So I feel like there's a lot of overlap there, but I definitely agree with Daniel's point about making sure that we have the consent of everybody before we start. Right. And that's why session zeros are so important, because when we talk about these issues and when we introduce them to each other, when we subject our PCs and this sort of a little bit of a part of ourselves to these experiences, we want to make sure that it's something that we are okay with, that this little part of ourselves that we're playing is okay with. And it's just I feel like it's such a loaded, not a loaded, but like very dense topic. And if we can definitely, I feel like we can even talk about this for like, I don't know, hours and just sort of get somewhere with it. But yeah, I find it so exciting to explore romance within TTRPGs because it comes in so many different forms. It comes in so many different styles. And I feel like that is a really wonderful way to help your PCs sort of, at least from a GM standpoint, help your PCs like really try new things out and see if they like it, if they don't like it.
Yeah, speaking of like poly relationships that Michelle you brought up before, one of the recent games that I played, it was a version of Good Society and we were playtesting something, and it was the end of that game was that it was actually three major characters ended up in an actual poly relationship. And I was like, finally, because it's really hard to get that to happen in games, I think, unless everyone is kind of on the same page. And I haven't really found games that specifically, actually, no, I think one of the, I think Under My Skin from the Romance trilogy has to do with that, but I don't recall specifically how it does it, but it doesn't happen in a lot of games. So that's another thing that is interesting to think about as well, where it's not mechanized that I've discovered so far. And I guess the basis, like both Daniel, you and Michelle said, of like managing like romance in TTRPGs is communication. So I guess my question is, how in all of your tables in your games, like how have you navigated this? Like did you do it in session zero where you're like, okay, is everyone okay with romance, or like where like what is your comfort level, or is it more like a case-by-case basis, like when it comes up and then you just kind of talk like out of game, be like, hey, it seems like my character is into your character, or vice versa? Like, how do you feel about it? So how does that usually happen?
I think, Jeremy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because when we played For the Queen, we had a romance relationship, you and I, and we actually didn't have a session zero.
We didn't have session zero.
So I'd love to like get your thoughts on like because obviously I consented to it. I never said out loud to it, but like what was the how did you navigate that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think back to the times like when my player characters in, like, for example, Legend of the Five Rings entered into a relationship, that there wasn't really a session zero for that either. It was very much a situation like our For the Queen game where it kind of moved along in this way where the other player consented to it. And then we talked about it afterwards on like Discord and came up with cool story threads and ways we can take that. But it sort of developed out of the role-playing experience. And so for something like that, like when my For the Queen character when I decided to make that character fixate on a random character at the table, and I happened to choose Steve, I think I knew that I wanted to establish my character as, a very emotional individual, someone suffering from, unrequited love. But I also wanted there to be a complete option for you to, to not lean into that. And so that's why I immediately planned on it being unrequited love. And then as the game progressed, my character sort of established a camaraderie with yours. And so I think, in games that I've played in the past, as I role play, I tend to kind of send out feelers and then other players at the table. And keep in mind, I don't really play in stream games. These are mostly home games where I know the individuals involved. So it's different. The other players might respond to those feelers, and then something natural might result from that. And then we might communicate that after a session, and then that becomes a major plot thread moving forward in the adventure, which is how it happened for my L5R game. Now, I think for a stream game especially one where you don't know everyone, that complicates the matter substantially. And I think for something like that, I don't know if I'd necessarily be able to do this because, I knew the player who I engaged with in L5R, and I know Steve from, doing all these L5R streams with him. But if I was just agreeing to do a stream game, I don't know anyone, I probably would not take that approach.
Yeah, I really like how you talked about, feelers, like putting that out there, right? And I think that
which is something people tend to do in real life.
Yeah,
also.
exactly.
So
and I think
it's
that
kind of easy to role play.
And I think that kind of relates to a way in which you can do that in games that don't facilitate this, right? Because if we're looking at so romance, sex, and intimacy, like Yoshi brought up in the chat, right? When we talk about intimacy, we don't just mean physical intimacy, right? There's emotional intimacy, right? There's intellectual intimacy, right? There's also like experiential intimacy, right? So things that kind of bring you together, like getting to know someone's mind, getting to know, someone physically, or getting to know someone through, hardships or experiences that bring you close together, right? So in Dungeons and Asians, Amar was like, well, my character doesn't know how to read the language of Xia because Amar's character wasn't from there. And so Amar had his character ask one of the NPCs that he kind of wanted to slowly romance to teach his character how to read. And so they have this intellectual intimacy that's happening now where that we're trying to develop that could turn into something else, right? And so like, yeah, Jeremy, I love what you said about putting out feelers and having like conversations outside of your game, like on Discord.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat, why would it necessarily be more complicated for a stream game? I don't think it's necessarily more complicated if it's a stream game where the parties involved. Like my For the Queen game was with Steve and, Agatha and
you knew everybody who was there.
I knew everybody involved. But I think in a situation where you do not know the people, then it becomes tricky because when you're role-playing romance and, for example, putting out feelers, I said that is often something that people do in real life in their own romantic relationships. Then it's very easy for the line between your character and yourself to blur. And if you're navigating that unknown territory with individuals that you do not know or have only come together with for the purpose of a single stream, there is the potential for harm to occur. And there's potential for a real blurring to occur between the role playing and what is role playing and what is actually, my own emotion coming out, and how are these other people responding to that and playing off of it. And I think if there is proper establishment of consent and a session zero in a game like this, or if it's like a long-term campaign where everybody takes time to discuss these sorts of things beforehand, it can be easier. But if it's like a one shot and you're just joining for the purposes of that one shot, I think it can be tricky. At least that's my perspective. I mean, I'm sure there are people who could navigate it quite well. I just am not certain if I would be able to.
Yeah, I think when you also talk about stream games, you talk about expectations that the
Perhaps,
audiences have over the program. I mean, I've been invited to games where it's like, okay, well, Steve, here's a good example. How does it roll?
Fuck yeah. Fuck
Okay,
yeah.
so yeah, so there was one, and so Steve and I were a couple in a game, and we decided it like an hour before.
So actually, I'll give you a little more context there. We were invited to the stream, both Daniel and I, to be separate characters on separate streams.
Yeah, separate episodes.
We didn't know this, but we both had decided we're going to play Asian coded characters in like this Frost Maiden playthrough and whatnot. And I had asked one of the main cast members, I would love to be a character who is romantically involved, either formerly or currently, or maybe future tense, with one of the main cast members. I'm very interested in telling that story. And the cast member said, none of us are comfortable with that. And I'm like, that's cool. I'll play like my other character, and like this is my idea for it. And then due to other reasons and whatnot, Daniel and I were then put into the same game. And Daniel and I were like, are we both playing Asian characters? And we're like, yeah.
But
Daniel,
also, are both our characters centered around food?
Yes, both the characters centered around food. And we just decided that we would be both mass-presenting characters who were in a very long-term relationship, romantically.
We ran a business together.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's some
what
real
were your
intimacy.
What was the food that you made?
We had a
what was the
food
food?
truck. We had a food truck.
Go for it, Daniel. Give some
well,
context here,
we had,
because
like,
people want it.
You know, I forget. My character was a ranger rogue,
Yes.
a hunter, and we ran a food truck in in the 10 towns, or a food stall that was basically frozen to a side of a building because it's so cold, because it's this permafrost, right? And our food was basically bringing warmth to everyone.
That's such a good idea.
So like our
so
romance, our
cute.
love was bringing
That's great.
warmth to everyone.
I'm so into it.
But like,
Share the warmth of our love with everyone.
but
who
like,
can-
but like,
Your food. Yeah.
so like, I was supposed to be on an episode, literally the episode before Steve, and the GM got sick, and it never happened, and so they were like, okay, you're gonna do this together. Steve and I had previously been talking about this anyways, and then we were like, oh shit, our characters are so similar in terms of like concept, not like mechanically. And you brought up being a couple, I think, Steve. And
That
I was
sounds like me, yeah.
And I was like, absolutely, I do. Let's do this. And we actually played Mahar's game, Falling. We should link that in the chat.
Yeah, I got it. Keep going.
We played Mahar's game, Falling, literally before we were going live. Like 30 minutes out, you and I are playing
Oh,
Mahar's micro
nice.
RPG, asking each other intimate questions
Yeah.
in front of
That's
the whole
so
cast who had never done anything like this before.
Right.
And in 20 minutes, we had a backstory, we had things to vibe off of, and we also had established romantic boundaries with each other before we even started. And then it just flowed naturally. And the cast of the rest of the regular cast were kind of like, we've never done this before. And it was cool teaching them that and showing them.
It's
Yeah, so-
cute.
I have a question for you, Michelle. So you kind of touched on like session 0 and kind of asking people what they're comfortable with and boundaries and things like that. So I'm curious about, how do you actually do it? Like what kind of questions do you ask, and then like what's the process?
So I literally, for my session zeros, I literally do two things. In terms of establishing this documentation, I am a big document person. I love having all this stuff to refer back to. I literally send out a questionnaire to all my PCs with, tell me about your character. What is their backstory? Who are they, etc., etc. One of my favorite games that I am DMing right now is my home game, Ravnica High, and all my PCs are teenagers. So of course, there's going to be some disaster teenage love happening. But I wanted to make sure that I got a good idea of what their preferences were, but also a good idea of who they were as a PC, because that way I can start creating NPC romance options that are essentially tailored to that individual, right? Because, and that's the other thing too, when you're creating partners for your PCs, there's so much to keep in mind with, you know, who is this PC? What is their story? What is their art going to be like? How is my NPC going to accent this or contrast with this? What role is this NPC going to play? One of my favorite players, I mean, they're all my favorite players. I love my PCs. I'm like a mom. I'm totally a mom GM. But one of my players, who's a really good friend of mine, she plays a warlock, and her patron is actually her girlfriend who's a demon. And so it's like, okay, what's this relationship all about? How do I make sure that the dynamic between these two characters is on even ground? And so like my solution was like, okay, I'm going to make it so this demon, she's really sweet, but she's not super bright. And the contract she actually accidentally signed with this PC is turned out to be something that she stole for her entertainment lawyer like father, and it's actually a record deal. It's not like a fully formed warlock contract. Like so now there's like now we're both stuck in this weird thing where we have to produce 3 records and also like figure out a compensation package. So stuff like that where you have to figure out
the
like
studio and they both reach for the dial.
yeah, so they're basically, we decided that they're the Wiggles but like Rakdos. So like,
oh my god, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah,
shut down the stream. It doesn't get any better than this.
What?
So that was how but I mean, these are the things that I love to think about as a GM when I'm creating NPCs. I have to think about things like power dynamics, like what is the relationship like going to be between these two characters? What are their personalities going to clash? Is it an attraction of opposites? If they're in a poly relationship, you know, like again, thinking about this PC NPC salad of like, how are these people going to complement and challenge each other as the campaign goes along? And I've got to admit, like, you've got to have so much emotional intelligence to like make sure that everyone's on the same page. And I think this is the stuff that I think about during my session zeros when I introduce romance in my campaigns. It's not just about the sexual preferences, and these are important, of course, and it's also about like, you know, which base are we going to, which base are you comfortable with? Are we doing a fade to black? What are the lines and veils? But also just like, who is this NPC and what role are they going to have, and how can I make sure that, you know, is this a healthy or an unhealthy relationship? All that good stuff. So anyway, I'm very proud of that one. The other ones are like really sweet as well. I think I had 2 goblins, like they decided to go out after defeating a shark-do crab, steaming it and eating it. So
valid. I like that. That's yeah, no, like if I was a goblin and like I had another goblin who I'm like, I'm kind of into this, and like we killed like a shark thing, and I'm like, we can eat this. Like that sounds like a date. Like everything's in there.
They asked each other to homecoming, and then the shark-do crab attacked them during homecoming. Oh my god! And they fireballed it, and I was like, yeah, between the fireball and the ice thing, like you steamed the shark-do crab. So. That's
my favorite episode of Buffy. Like I remember that happening. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Buffy. Yeah. So in terms of like tools, I think that are useful for people. If they want to GM a game, what I've been discovering recently with all the online games I've been playing is people have started putting in basically a safety tab onto the Google Sheets that they use for character keepers. And this on the safety tab, they make it so it's a clicking thing, so you could check like things that you want lined or veiled or asked first, so things like, you know, eyeball injury and things like that. But then to the side of it, people have also started putting a romance section where it's romance with PCs, romance with NPCs, and then you can choose, you put in your name, and then you can check mark yes, or ask first, or no. Or I think it was just yes or no. I think it was just yes or no, sorry. So you can basically tell everyone in a way where it's not as awkward, like you have to, like it's weird to like say it, to be like, so everyone, are you okay with romancing each other? And everyone be like, I guess. Like that feels like a peer pressure thing, but when it's just a checkmark thing that people can do by themselves, even though they're putting their name in, for some reason it really helps everyone feel safer in doing it. And then at least for me, I really like that I could choose to say that yes, I am into it, or no, I'm not. And everyone, because it exists as a mechanic, it feels more official and people respect that. And I think that's a really good way of establishing like clear boundaries for people who don't want to engage with it, and then also a great signal for people who do want to engage with it.
So something I think is really interesting is that in the D&D spaces that I'm in, if there was such a structure, the default is no. In Dungeons and Dragons, the default is like you don't want a relationship, like a romance with another player character. And the reason is because of the fear, the shame of having to want to tell those stories. So in like a D&D sense, it's kind of like you actually kind of have to ask explicitly, like, are you interested in actually having a romance with other player characters? And that is a product of other community spaces and like community, I guess, the zeitgeist, if you want to call it
the
that.
culture of playing D&D, right?
Yeah.
Adventurously. I mean, like there's also the objective of playing D&D in the first place, right? A lot of people play D&D because they want to do the combat and the violence, right? Without thinking that, of course, there is also intimacy to that,
right,
as well.
Yeah. And I do also want to say, Michelle, like, I super respect the fact that you put so much thought into coming up with like love interests for your PCs.
I'm like thrown back how great that is.
I mean,
so sweet.
Romance, it's one, like, I care about, again, like, I'm a mom when it comes to my PCs. I want to bring my games are always like comedic and wholesome, and I want to bring that same sense of exhilaration to my PCs. But it's also just I don't, it's like that goes for all of my NPCs. I have like pages and pages of documentation. I'm just like, here are all my NPCs, here they are as characters, this is what kind of breakfast they enjoy and stuff like that. But romance, I just think is so, those relationships can really make or break a person. And I feel like putting the thought and the detail into it, just one, it respects the true IRL world nature of those relationships, and two, it ups the storytelling just up to the next degree. And it's really wonderful to just surprise your PCs and have those tender, lovely, sweet moments, or not so sweet, depends on what they want, right?
A part of me is like, wow, should we just do like a D&D mini-series that's not Dungeons and Asians, where we have romance in D&D to show people how we would do it?
I would love that.
It doesn't have to be D&D, but yeah.
D&D has like, it has
roll for kissing.
Roll for kissing. Critical fail. What happens?
You miss entirely. You face plant right into the ground. You just like
you bump your teeth against
each other. You do damage.
Too much teeth. You bite them. They start bleeding.
There's
Great.
a lot
of fun on that.
There's a lot that could be done there in terms of like the kind of half-baked mechanics in D&D right now regarding like your ideals, your flaws, your, you know, all that stuff on the right-hand side of the character sheet.
I love that stuff.
Yeah.
That a lot of people don't even fill in because it requires, you know, it's not really there's not really a mechanic
because it doesn't have a mechanical payoff. Which is why in these kind of games, people want to engage with them, because they give you, in a way, like, I mean, I'm just just an example. In the Sword of the Crown, the Unspeakable Power, most of the stuff that you get, for example, Sex with the Screw. The Screw is a playbook that is the torturer. And you can ask like one of the questions that is in your move, where you basically like get secrets out of people if you engage with if it's sex with a screw. For this game specifically, it's sex, but it's just, there's like a mechanical payoff out of these kind of things, so then people remember, oh hey, maybe I want to do that, and then the other person's like, oh hey, I also have a move where I also get something out of this. So then that's why people would actually want to engage with it.
Ross Rifles has an intimacy move.
I've actually found that, like, for certain, just to use D&D as the popular example, for certain characters that I've created, like the first character I made, a ranger, and he had a very, you know, deep backstory involving his wife, who died and was brought back to life, and it was a major facet of his character. And I played him in a couple different campaigns, and in one campaign I remember like I was emphasizing this backstory, and the DM didn't know what to do with it because I guess it's not a mechanic. And I remember that being disappointing for me. And it's like, if that was introduced as a formal mechanic, like relationships, intimacy that
Yeah.
your character might have, would a lot of players and DMs engage with it within that DMD culture? I'm not sure. I like to think that they would.
I would actually say yes. So
Okay.
here's my thought. Like, I think what we're seeing right now with the introduction of these games and with like dating sims and all this stuff is a natural evolution of RPGs, of TTRPGs, right? When we started back, like look at the beginning days of Gary Gygax and people like Stranger Things, etc. It was a power fantasy, right? And in many ways, this is just a continuation of that. And I think that speaks to the increased diversity that we're seeing of players entering this space and wanting more and seeing the potential of mechanics and things like that can be codified in tools into areas that we haven't really even considered, right? And I think that is... I think that's awesome. I just think that's a natural part of what we want. I think people would be really excited to have this there. It's like you get like a really cool spatula and it's a silicon spatula. You're like, oh man, spatula's in my kitchen. I can like do stuff with it. You don't have to, but it's there,
Yeah. Agatha, are you going to talk about bonds in Dungeon World?
I was going to talk about bonds. I know I talk about Dungeon World, or not specifically Dungeon World, hacks of Dungeon World a lot. But I do think, like, I wonder if that's a pretty good way to introduce or to mechanize this sort of thing, like backstory relationships in, say, like D&D or another game that doesn't have that in there, which is to have something like bonds where, like, if you roll to, like, I don't know, are there aid mechanics? I think there is. Yeah, there is in D&D in 5e.
Yeah.
But I think if this gives you advantage or something like that, then I think people would be really into that, right? Like, because again, there's the mechanical payoff. So it's like double win. You get more story. You also get, I don't know, you get to not fail as much.
I think
you
if
get,
I was
like,
going
tangible benefits. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Yes.
No, sorry. That's a good point. Like, you get, like, I want benefits in D&D for having a romance with other players and other NPCs and things like that. But you'll often get, if I can like take this role of the community and whatnot, and admittedly more of the toxic community, like, they're going to say it's not balanced. It's an unbalanced mechanic. I can't balance my monsters against PCs being romantically involved. And like, technically, I think they're correct. Like, you can't actually balance for the idea that the monster will make an assumption that this is how powerful they need to be, with the assumption that like players will be romantically involved for these mechanical benefits. And like, that's like it's a weird thing to talk about. And like, I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, because there's one there's one problem with if you say that this is, if you have hard rules on romance, right, or hard rules on intimacy, because there are, like we've talked about, there are different kinds of romance and there are different types of intimacy, right? Some people might see it as just sex. Some people might have sex out of the equation entirely. Physical intimacy. Some people might value, emotional intimacy over physical intimacy, or vice versa, right? I think the way I would kind of get over it, and I'm very curious as to what they would, if they would even consider doing this for 6th edition D&D, is how you actually get XP or level up. Because D&D and its character sheets are designed to be blank canvases for any type of character, not characters that are geared towards romance, like in Powered by the Apocalypse games. You have to account for that in your player base as well.
That's true.
So the way I would kind of see it is, you have your bonds, your flaws, your ideals, and all of that, right? I would have those tied to how you level up, very much like hitting a certain thing in a hitting a thing in Powered by Apocalypse is when you when,
like flags.
yeah, or
uh,
like when you
Milestones,
or
yeah.
in Lady Blackbird when you hit a key in Lady Blackbird.
Yeah.
That's how I would do milestone level ups. Or if level ups or
or
leveling
you get
up,
XP.
yeah, or if you get XP, and I always kind of go to the year zero engine and the way they level up in those games, because leveling up is always based on role playing rather than what you mechanically have done in game. So you get XP for putting yourself in danger, ambiguous danger, for and they call it a PC buddy, right? But that is a PC that you are closer to than the others, right?
That's so cute.
Or you get XP if your personal problem puts the rest of the group in danger. So what I would love to see out of D&D, or if I were to just change the way I would play D&D, is I would actually reward players with something like hero points, which I think is a really cool optional rule in D&D. I would reward players with hero points for actually acting on those character traits that are more narrative. And then hero points in general would allow you to do more narratively in the game as well. Are all of you familiar with the hero points optional rules?
I think you should go over it.
Right?
Sorry?
They're like bennies, right? Or like fate points.
Why don't you define it? Because
Yeah.
I don't use hero points in my game,
So-
and I use another system, and it's not working out great. But we'll talk about that later.
Okay. Wait, you're using it and it's not working out well?
I decided to use a different system, which I thought would
I
be
see.
more would tell better stories. But actually, it broke D&D for me, and now I have to figure out a way to fix it. And what a common story of trying to introduce a new element to D&D. It breaks your game, and now it's up to you to fix it.
Well, here's the thing,
I
like a relationship, right? Introducing new mechanics to your game is all about expectations. If your expectations don't match the expectations of your players, even if something does work theoretically, it won't work out in practice.
So what are hero points?
Okay, so hero points are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and they are basically in D&D. They're framed as a way to make your games more epic. So in the Dungeon Master's Guide, characters start with, and I've pulled up D&D Beyond right now. Shout out to D&D Beyond. Characters start with 5 hero points, right? And every time you gain a level, you lose unspent hero points and you gain a new total of 5 plus half your level, right? It's kind of like the way action points work in Quest, right? They are your economy to do epic things, right? You could spend hero points when you roll dice. And spending hero points allows you to roll an extra die alongside that d20. But there are other ways that you can use hero points that people have kind of talked about from in the here, let me just pull it up. So Pathfinder also has hero points, and that was in their SRD. I'll actually link that in the Twitch chat for everyone to read. But one of the things that I used in D&D with regards to hero points was actually something that I found online. And it was something that I found on a website called D&D 5e Road Test. And hero points are basically used in like 1, 2, 3, or 5 point chunks. And so, for instance, if you use 5 hero points, you can take an additional turn. Or you could regain the use of your abilities as if you had a long rest, even though you didn't take a long rest. So narratively, that could be like, you really push through, just like, ah! And then Goku's there and you're one-handed defeating Cell. Or like you could spend a hero point and you can impose disadvantage upon somebody. And so I use that in the autism program I run to introduce more narrative into what the players were doing with the dice.
My issue with hero points, as written in the Dungeon Master's Guide, is that
Yeah.
they're very related to combat.
It's very combat related.
It felt just more like an alternate version of inspiration to me. It felt
It
like
is.
something from the
It feels like bardic.
It's bardic
from the-
inspiration.
yeah,
It's
from the
it's-
D&D Next
yeah.
playtest that they just threw in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I do like the Pathfinder SRD rules for hero points a bit better because they at least have examples like you could use these if your character creates if your character completes an arc related to their personal growth. It's listed under stuff the GM could do, or if your character like develops in a certain way. If there's like if you're playing a cleric and you meet like your god or your goddess and like your faith increases.
Yep.
The 5e ones as written in the DMG, I'm just like, this is too close to just
It's bardic inspiration
advantage for me. Yeah.
The one that I shared in the Twitch chat, the D&D 5e road test.obsidianportal.com, is the one that I used, and I really liked it, with the caveat of every time you use the hero point, there has to be a narrative prompt that you inject into the story, and then that's how you use moves in Powered by the Apocalypse games. Every single move has a narrative trigger.
I wish that was included in the actual text.
Yes,
instead of like it being like a homebrew add-on, which is my problem with a lot of 5th edition rules as is.
So my question, as a as someone who doesn't run D&D and only plays in one D&D game right now, I remember, Steve, we were talking about this before, where like D&D wasn't made specifically to be about relationships of any kind, really, or at least not according to the mechanics, right? So my question is, it's very effective, in my opinion, at creating the kind of experience that the rules want you to have, which is like you fight, you get loot, you level up, and it's like really cool to like level up into like cool branches of different prestige thingamabobs that I don't know the word for, but basically like it does that part of like, oh, like I get to I can min-max or not really well. Like that's really fun. So should D&D have these kind of like,
this is the question,
romance mechanics?
I think it should.
But for me, if I want to play like a romance game or whatever, or if I want romance in my games, I just go to something else.
That's the other thing.
Actually supports that.
Like,
I don't think it's necessary, but that's also because
super loaded question.
That's the thing. Like, it's always like you see these folks talking about they're incredible sounding games like on Twitter, and a lot of people in the comment section are like, why aren't you using another system? And it's like they're probably, and I always feel conflicted because there are systems that do that sort of thing better, but it's also like if they want to play D&D, let them play D&D. And it's I don't know.
I think that there's a lot of and when you were saying, Agatha, it was really funny when you said like, should D&D have a romance thing, and that whole Jurassic Park thing like popped in my head. Like, well, just because we didn't stop to think we should.
Are you the John Hammond of TTRPGs?
Yes.
I'll take off my shirt and just lean over and just be like,
okay, well, Steve's Ian Malcolm then.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
So you like Jeff Goldblum is what I'm going for.
I went for the character's name.
Like
I do. I think that's a valid question. Like, should a combat focused role-playing system,
because a lot of the concerns that are being brought up have to do with like balance and mechanics, right? And so and it's coming from like, okay, the player base have this expectation of like you want to like maximize what like, and then like balance about like combat is really important, and how does that factor into these mechanics? And I see that my question now is like, if it's so hard, why do it? But I also, it's just coming from a very different perspective, I guess. What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, I don't think that, I don't think you're wrong. I think that it's not a question of like, I don't think that it's not a matter of like, is it too hard? Like, it's a matter of, is it a good thing given the intrinsic nature of the RPG and what it was designed for? I think 5e in particular is a very interesting example because it is what dominates the cultural atmosphere vis-a-vis RPG games, right? And because it is the cultural linchpin and lodestone of this community, there is that expectation of like, oh, it should do all the things, right? And yeah, I think that people are naturally starting to put romance in their games. So my answer is yes, because it's happening already. One way or another, it's going to go in that direction. It's what we're seeing already with the introduction of these indie games. I don't see much reason to not include it. Whether or not how to do it mechanically, I mean, I was sitting here thinking like, well, romance and relationships have to do with wisdom, so I'm thinking maybe some kind of wisdom bonus.
Roll a
Like maybe you get like just bardic but only for wisdom, or for certain skill rolls. But I think it is worth pursuing,
Yeah.
for like the flagship RPG. I think so. We should build Jurassic Park. We should get that T-Rex out there.
Yeah, let's get like the
I feel like,
and then
you know,
the thing falls.
yeah, going with the Jurassic Park analogy, I feel like D&D has already experimented a little bit with like, you know, the capturing the flies in amber. They've already got like a system of like
So is
bonds
romance
and
the
flaws
Indominus
and
Rex
stuff.
then?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to-
it's a big thing.
Like I feel conflicted because whenever people talk about like I want to play like a romance RPG, I'm like they're better games. You could play like a Powered by the Apocalypse game, but a lot of times they want to play that using D&D because, you know, particularly new TTRPG players, because they've heard about D&D and they might not have heard of Powered by the Apocalypse. And then it's like, so I do feel conflicted. At the same time, I do feel like D&D has kind of messed around with these ideas of character relationships and bonds and a little bit, but not enough. And maybe an actual mechanic or at least a section devoted to it in a future edition would help things.
So something that really helped my D&D games with romance is playing other romance games. And Agatha, when we played Starcrossed, it gave me an opportunity to like off air to like really digest Starcrossed and like what it's trying to do. And StarCraft was, sorry, one sec.
StarCraft.
You said StarCraft.
Yes.
Sorry, my Spotify started playing.
What song?
And so my Alexa was just like, "Oh, you want to listen to some Papa Roach?" And I'm like, "Well, not right now, but
What a throwback, Papa Roach.
yeah." Anyways, Starcrossed gave me the prompts. Like the prompts of Starcrossed was like, "Hey, every time someone like touches or like seeks to like get the contact, that is the prompt to roll a die, because that is the moment where you want the randomness to like give you a prompt. Like you've come across this like area and like you want to see what's gonna happen. And I've adopted that Dungeons and Dragons. It's just that at this point, I let them add like their wisdom to it or like some other BS, and like I don't really care. Like at that moment in time, I'm just basically saying like roll a die and see what happens, because no one knows what's going to happen, and that's compelling. Like the compelling action is the randomness of it. So
Yes,
when
I do agree with that.
when I have a PC and NPC who are like they like one touches each other's arm to like give them support, I want the game to say, hey, roll the die, because maybe it is a positive thing or maybe it's a negative thing, because in real life sometimes you do that, you take the risk and it does not work out, and that's very human. And that I think that I think GMs across our platform should like think about and begin to adopt, because we want to tell very human stories.
Yeah, that's fair. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Agatha. Yeah.
Jeremy, I think what you said is a really interesting thing as for me, because we're obviously coming from almost diametrically opposite perspectives, where well, actually both of our introductions to TTRPG is through D&D, but this is very much like your point of view is that people should be able to have what they want in the system that they want, right? Like, and it should be supported by the system that they want to play in. And I think that's fair. But I also think about it like TTRPG is just a very wide thing. Like, and if you want to have this specific experience and you're finding it lacking in your particular game, eventually you will look for other sources and then find things that work out better for you, is how I see it. Because like, just because you like playing I do enjoy playing D&D actually now, with this specific group. It's with my partner and his friends, but I don't I don't look for romance specifically in this game, because it's just that's not what I'm here for. But then I get it out of other things, and I think that like I just feel like it's there are so many options that are so fun, and that will provide so many different kinds of experiences in terms of even just like intimacy in different ways in that you can role play.
So
in
I go
role-playing
back and
games.
forth. Like I
Right.
was, I felt that way, and then I changed my mind, and I kind of like I'm kind of a mixture of both. I think the reason why I say I kind of wish D&D would have like maybe at least page devoted to romance and relationships in a future edition is because there's a lot of optional rules in the game, and there's a lot of new players, you know, as Michelle said, that are coming in and are going to want to carry out these sort of role-playing experiences using, like, you know, the world's greatest role-playing game, whatever copy Wizards uses to describe it. So I think like, and once again,
Right.
D&D
just give people
has this like
resources.
bonds and flaws thing. So perhaps maybe I think it would be an interesting element to officially add. It doesn't have to be substantial, but I think something, you know, maybe a bit of guidance that's more than just let the GM handle it, which 5th edition does a lot of. And then that I think could also, you know, I think people are going to be interested. People who enter this hobby space are going to be interested and are probably going to start looking for other games to really create those sorts of experiences that they crave for. But I think for, you know, newbies, and I DM for mostly new players, I think it would be cool to have kind of an official thing to fall back on. But once again, like I go back and forth. I'm really not sure. Some days I get mad at you know, D&D trying to be everything, and I'm like, there's so many other indie games that can do this better, or, you know, why don't we look towards there instead?
So I think to summarize, I think like Agatha, you and I are very much in the same boat. Is that I think you and I are into the story, not the game, right? So if there's a game that helps you tell a particular story, you'll play that game. And we're not tied to a particular thing. At least that's how I've read you as a gamer in the years that I've known you, right? And that's how I am. Like I'm into the story. I'm less so into the game. The thing that I think D&D should do, and here's where I kind of approach D&D as like somebody who uses it in like a therapeutic setting, but also used it in an educational setting, right? D&D is lacking a section of the book, and it's got to go in the player's handbook. And it's a section of the book on player interconnectedness. So if I were to do something in 6th edition, this is what I would do. And this is a very, very simple change. Before you even dive into your ancestries and your classes, you are first going to present the players with a section on bringing the group together, right? And that also takes a lot of the narrative load off of the GM to be like, okay, well, how do I bring the players together? Okay, you meet at a tavern, and then something happens, right? But the first section in the 6th edition player's handbook, as it goes into character creation, should be party interconnectedness. So that is going to be a section on forming the party. What is your party's concept? And I take this directly from Coriolis, because the first section in Coriolis is, what is your group concept? In Coriolis, you do, what is your group? And then your group determines what everyone's role in the group is, and that's your individual character, right? So what is your party, right? And what binds all of you together? So if let's do this exercise right now, right? So there's 5 of us right now, and see this, our little noodle dragon logo is our GM. What do we want our party to be, right? What is one activity that you would want your character or to do with all of our characters? So for me, I would love for my character to be a scribe who is documenting interesting ingredients. That's what I want, right? That's what I want my character to do. So who would want to go next? Okay, so
Michelle, go.
So Michelle, what you want to do, like, what do you want to do, and how can that kind of tie into what has already been said?
Oh, this is improv. This is great.
I fucking love this shit. Yeah.
Yeah,
I love
this is yes anding, and I love it. I would love to be a a smuggler
Okay.
who is here to steal special ingredients.
Okay, so you're a smuggler, and we haven't even noticed how we have not gotten into the D&D classes yet. So right now we have somebody who is writing. My character is writing a cookbook, and your character is a smuggler who has profited off of selling exotic ingredients, maybe, right? Okay, so who's next?
So my character is 100% the person who loves the challenge of seeking hard to find ingredients, like the challenge of like climbing that mountain or like going to a place that you really shouldn't go to find that ingredient. Like that is alluring to them.
Thrive in dangerous scenarios.
Yeah, I'm a danger seeker.
Like a
yeah,
rush.
I want that.
Okay, so we have a thrill seeker, we have a profiteer, we have a knowledge seeker. Jeremy or Agatha?
I think, yeah, I originally said hot pot when you said an activity that we want to do together. I feel like
Hot pot, hot pot, there you go.
I love to do hot pot. Yeah.
I feel like I
just
would
want a
like
hot
to
pot.
be. I feel like I would like to be like an innkeeper or something that actually has
Yeah.
the space
Yeah.
needed to cook this stuff. Like I want to have the hot pot facility. Like I want to be like the guild master or the merchant or the innkeeper that has the space needed to encourage, or maybe is even like financing your cookbook writing.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. So we have the financier, right? We
Yeah.
have the restaurateur. So Agatha, what about you?
My character is going to be there for the smooches.
Yeah.
Nice.
Because that is their goal. They are on this trip because it takes them to a lot of different places, meeting a lot of different people, lots of
Yeah.
opportunities.
What's more intimate than cooking together?
Spicy spooch.
Spicy
Ooh,
smooches.
Yeah.
Smooches and serpents. Something like that.
Smooches and Serpents, a
Smooches
new
and Serpents.
RPG.
But so here's the thing. So we've got Agatha. Your character is wants to experience intimacy with many different kinds of people, right? Steve's
Yes.
character is a thrill seeker seeking danger. Michelle's character is a profiteer, and Jeremy's character is a financier of expeditions.
And
There's
probably someone who also wants to experience intimacy by like making all this happen.
You're making all this happen, right?
100%.
Because you're putting everybody together. So there we go, right? 5 minutes, we have a group concept. We have a narrative sort of leader in Jeremy's character who has brought everyone together, right? Maybe we've all been hired by Jeremy's character, or maybe we're all investors in this hot pot place.
Maybe
that
I have
has
the vision, but I
the
can't
vision.
actually cook.
Yeah, and we
And
have
so there we go.
we're all investors in a hot pot place that has been built over this portal. Here's our yawning portal. Has been built over this portal, right? Or has been
It's just a
built
big hot pot.
or has been built has been hot pot or has
It's just
been
a big hot pot.
built at a hub for transport, right? And as a GM, if all 5 of my players, so us, said that, I'd be like, okay, well, our adventure is always going to end back at the restaurant. It will start at the restaurant and end at the restaurant, and we
So
may not
good.
even leave the restaurant. Okay, so what are our classes? Daniel, I'm the bard. Michelle's like the rogue. Steve, you could be any number of things, right? Ranger, right?
Sure,
Agatha, you could be any number of things.
Also a bard.
Also a bard. And then
Also a
Jeremy,
bard.
yours
don't
could
know.
be. I don't know. What would yours be?
I don't know. I feel Ragnarok Online had a class called the Merchant. There's no class like that in D&D.
I love this idea of like maybe you're like a paladin or a cleric, and your faith
Yeah,
is all about
maybe
bringing
I'll
people
be like-
together.
Maybe
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe you call this restaurant the temple.
I always wanted to be maybe I'll be like a cleric whose I don't know, faith is bringing people together and creating this vibe of camaraderie through
Faith through food is not a
Faith
new
through food.
idea.
And maybe
But
we
the
all have
irony
one
is
level.
I can't cook, so there we go.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, maybe we all have one level in cleric or paladin. There
Yeah.
you go.
That'd be
Right.
cool.
Oh my
and,
god.
and here we go. So like that's the first section, and then we're now having a conversation about what our classes are and what we want to play based on these narrative concepts that we have in mind. We have now developed the first layer of the interconnectedness of this party.
That's
and so
very
the
interesting.
first section
really cool,
of the
yeah.
6th edition Player's Handbook,
Wow.
I would recommend, should have that. It should have, how do you bring the party together? What binds everyone together? And
Yeah.
then there should be optional rules within this chapter. So again, optional rules that are not buried in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but are for players to use, right? So, okay, optional rules for intimacy. How do we handle that? And how do we mechanize intimacy? This could be like how they do it in Masks, how characters have like hold things over one another, like masks? Or are these like a group? So in my game Ross Rifles, there are two intimacy mechanics. One is a move that's called Provide Comfort. So provide comfort relieves stress. This could be like through physical intimacy. This could be through emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, or anything like that, right? But there is also a mechanic called morale. And morale is a shared pool that the party can gain through role playing. And when you use morale, you can add a bonus to your roll, which in a PBTA game is hugely impactful. Getting a +1 is huge, right? And getting a +1 on top of an existing bonus you have from an ability is gigantic. But here's the thing. In order to use a morale token or morale point, you have to have the consent of the group. So the morale represents the connectiveness between all of you. So if I want to do something, I'd be like, okay, can I use one of the morale tokens that we've all earned together? Right? So what Wizards should do is put a party concept or a party dynamic section that goes before the the character creation section. And within this section, there need to be a list of questions that bring everyone together. These questions need to be ambiguous enough so that children can play this, adults can play this, children and adults can play this. Anybody can use these questions without feeling like they're being forced into something. What is your group concept? What do you want to do? What are your goals? And these questions need to be on the sheets. Okay.
I think that's pretty brilliant. I'm actually just kind of like, yeah, this is one of the reasons why I love like one-shot games like Honey Heist, for example.
Yeah.
It's just like the conceit is there. You're a bunch of bears.
Yeah, exactly. You already know what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Or like a cool game like Lady Blackbird. You know what you're doing in Lady Blackbird, but the dynamics between the characters can change. And then, of course, in this section, there are then the optional rules for intimacy, romance, or I would just call it intimacy, right?
Yeah.
Because
I would too.
Because if you say here are the rules for sex means very different things to people, right? But
And also
intimacy,
D&D is not that kind of a game.
well,
right?
there were books for that.
Right, but like the core game is not about that because for example in The Sword, the Crown, the Unspeakable Power, it's a game that's mimicking the kind of like edgy, kind of like bloody, sexy vibe of Game of Thrones. Not mimicking, but it's evoking that. So that's why they use that word. And also in Apocalypse World, the first edition, using that word has a very specific purpose, but I don't feel like that's the vibe that I get from like core D&D.
But if you use intimacy in D&D, intimacy in D&D could be like, Steve and I, we're standing back to back. I've got my twin hand crossbows out. I'm out of bolts. We're surrounded by goblins. Steve's got like a big sword or something, chipped all the hell from all the shields that Steve has hit. We're just standing there completely surrounded. I drop my crossbows. Our bard arrives on a steed and begins playing music, and we break out into dance. And that is intimacy to me in a game. You could do that. I don't know why that was my example, but apparently that's something
I don't know why
It's
either.
an oddly specific example.
I was just like, is it like Genuine Pony starts playing?
Oh no, I was thinking like
Shit.
Two Towers, and then Gandalf arrives, and then it's a Bollywood movie, and I really like this for some reason.
I was thinking actually that really brought me to that. There's a really great scene in Magic Mike Extra Large, XXL, where Joe Manganiello is tasked to go. His quest is to go to the convenience store and to make the salesperson laugh.
Yeah.
And that's a whole thing. And I feel like, yeah, I would absolutely love to have a scene like that and like be able to play that mechanically with my players or myself. Like, yeah.
But like intimacy can mean different things. It could be Joe Manganiello, sexying it up in a convenience store, or it could be two players like fighting back to back until the bitter end.
Or it could be like a mentor and a mentee, like talking about, a lesson that needs to be learned, and it's a deep emotional attachment.
Or a ranger and a druid collecting berries and sharing their knowledge and relationship with nature with one another. Right? So
I think
that's what I would do.
Yeah, but in the meantime, since we don't have that for, I guess, like for games, these specific games, for example, like D&D and Pathfinder, what are tools that people can use right now if they want to have romance in their games? And like, how do we? So we've said like Session Zero, talking about what people's lines and veils are. We've talked about those clicky things where, if you want, you
Safety
can
tools.
make safety tools where people can choose to signal whether they want to engage with this or not, and what kind of engagement they want. So those are some things. And then, did we want to talk a little bit about safety tools, or are we?
I think that's another episode because we're at time. But I think this I know, but I think this does lead into another topic that we should cover on the wrap up. I actually wrote it down in our digital notebook as a podcast topic about the role of the GM.
Hey,
What role does the GM play? And I think that's something that needs to be talked about when it comes to romance. So, like, for any game, I think that that is going to have romance, or where players want to have romance, you need to find out if romance is going to be a part of your game to begin with, right? And that's why Session Zero is there for you. And I think the only other thing you need to do if you want romance in your game is to set the expectation that the GM is not going to be the one to mediate or be the sole arbiter of player versus player and player romance, right? The GM cannot tell the players that they cannot be together. The GM can remind players that things that they're doing might violate or be close to violating people's lines and veils. But in terms of narrative, as long as everything is within the bounds of the safety tools and the parameters that you've already established, the GM should accept, and the players should understand, the GM is there to help facilitate the stories that the players want to tell.
I almost feel like another really good thing too is to maybe just have the two players or two or more players who are going to have that relationship as PCs have a conversation about, those particular lines and boundaries and how the dynamics of that relationship is going to go down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They talk on the side, like Steve and Kiana.
Mm-hmm.
or me and you,
You
or
and
even
I.
me and Jeremy, like in the middle of the action,
Yeah.
where
And-
we didn't talk about it explicitly, but like we were telegraphing very clearly to each other like what we thought was going to happen, and we had a very much like give and take relationship between our characters, but like we were reading each other very explicitly.
Yeah, and I will say, like, telling other players to just say read each other. It can be a sort of a
Yeah, it's
dangerous
tricky.
slope. It's tricky.
It's tricky,
Yeah.
right? Totally.
Because you don't want to you want to be affirmative with the consent that you give other players, right?
Yeah.
But this also,
Totally.
like, you and Jeremy spent 40 hours, talking about like very intimate things when we were doing the L5R stream. So you had that background. But to say it to the people who are watching this, like, affirmative consent is really important at the table when you're talking about romance and character relationships or any interactions that you are having with the other players.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else we want to add? I know that
I have so
there's
much more to say
much.
about romance in RPGs. I want to talk about, actually, in a different episode, like actual sex in RPGs, like characters
Yes.
actually being intimate and like having sex, and like what sex means, because like it doesn't mean just one thing. Like it's very like a large spectrum of that, and what sex means between characters, between individuals, is very nuanced, and like there's a lot of story to tell. And even in D&D, if that's like your ship, the idea of like characters having sex and like what that does to affect the story, it's very impactful. And like if you want to lean into it, you absolutely can, and there's a lot of value in that.
I got you there,
Oh.
Steve, because on episode 19 of the Asians Represent podcast, we talked about sex, relationships, and TTRPGs with our
We
guests,
did.
Cleo Yensu Davis and Sharang Biswas.
Yeah.
So we should talk about that again, and I would love to have those two on the show as well, and of course Michelle and Jeremy, if you'd like to come back. I'm actually going to link to that in our Twitch chat, and I'll link to it on the YouTube video. If you also want to explore or start thinking about, sex in your games, and more, erotic themes in your games, there's also a game called Honey and Hot Wax, and it's an anthology that's published by Pelgrane Press. And what's really cool about this game is that, first of all, like the they had an amazing group of authors and designers. But what's also cool is that the anthology was actually made possible in part by a grant from the Effing Foundation for Sex Positivity. So there are very few TTRPG books like this. So if you want to, go deeper into the intimacy and TTRPGs, cannot recommend Honey and Hot Wax more, because it's so good. So check that out, and I believe it's out. Like if you even read the prompt, it's sex is, and then they give you all these different things that are related to the games. Sex is exploring your partner's body like an adventurer in a surreal landscape, experimenting at a BDSM party in search of your perfect kink match, helping your lover reach new heights of pleasure with your vampire bite, a confusing yet exciting gossip topic for slumber parties, masturbating with balloons and talking about it in the chat room, not gay if it's with your bro, almost everything you do if you're hosting an alien symbiote, and difficult to describe using only a plate of sandwiches. So perhaps in a future episode we will talk about, we'll dive more into sex and physical intimacy in TTRPGs and how to do that, and how it's been done poorly in the past, like D&D's Book of Vile Darkness, or the way
really?
I own a copy of that book.
Nice.
Or how the Bard ended up in Pathfinder and D&D 3.5, specifically Pathfinder First Edition, because it got real yucky with how the Bard can really mess with agency. But that said, we've run out of time, and we have a whole bunch of ideas for future episodes. Michelle, Jeremy, I am so grateful that you joined us for this episode. This was, I felt very vulnerable, and I think that's a good thing. And Agatha, I'm super happy that you brought this up, because I know this is something that you wanted to talk about for a long time on Asians Represent, and I hope this is the first time. And Steve, I love you.
I love you too.
What a difference.
But also, Steve, like,
Now dance for the goblins. Dance.
That said, Kiln Fiend Potter, that's Michelle on Twitter. Pixel Grotto, that's Jeremy. Head to pixelgrotto.tumblr.com. Read Jeremy's blog and Jeremy's articles in D&D Beyond.
I'm gonna write my thoughts on Cyberpunk 2077 after having finally beaten it.
Damn.
Ooh, damn! You beat the game.
I finally beat the game. I did it earlier.
All right.
I just haven't had time to
Oh,
write
no
it.
spoilers.
All right.
I haven't written
Michelle,
it yet. I'll write it later.
you've also got a podcast.
Yes, I also have a podcast. It's the Loregoyfs. If you're into Magic lore, Magic the Gathering lore, and you want to hear our comedic takes on it, absolutely listen to us. We are absolutely 100% faithful to every single story, but we do talk a lot
nice.
about it, and we love poking fun at the things that we are passionate about. So
Ugh, I
Head
can't
on
wait to
over.
talk Magic with you on this.
yes,
Oh.
I'm just like just pulling out a big briefcase and goes thunk on the desk. Like, yes,
So let's
I'm
talk
here.
about it.
so let's talk about this.
I
Yes.
can't wait. Also, next Saturday, Kara Tour. First episode of the month. First Saturday of every month, we got Kara Tour. Next Wednesday, we also have the finale of our Balik Bayan. Agatha and I are talking behind the scenes about some new stuff that we're going to be doing. Super exciting. Bureau of Paranatural Survey. No cast yet, but if you're interested, send me a DM. I'll always down to talk. This will be primarily one-shots set in a shared universe. So yeah. Thank you, everyone, for watching. This has been the wrap-up, and I love all y'all so much. Bye.
Bye.